Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Hope One Show. This is your host, Jorge Gil. Once again, Frank is still not present, but I'm sure he's going to be back Monday. So, again, thank you for your prayers. We're still praying for him, safe travels, and for his dad. And today we're going to have a fantastic guest. I mean, this guy is a research machine. He has been doing excellent work on apologetics and theology, and he's actually grabbing all of this information that he's able to research and distill it and then bring it down into this amazing, entertaining, documentary style production videos that he put on YouTube. So yes, I'm talking about Michael Jones, the president and founder of Inspiring Philosophy. And without further ado, I'm gonna bring Mike into the show. Hey Mike, what's happening?
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Just thrilled to have you here, man. We love what you do. You're really reaching the audience that we want to reach, and that is the young people, the people who live on YouTube, the people who really need to have these visuals in order to get interested and get in the word. And hopefully, once they start looking into it more, they get convicted and they come to the foot of the cross. So that's exactly what we do. And here at Hope One, we invite people who are really doing the kingdom's work, and they're putting the hope out there. But today we're going to talk about a controversial topic, and a topic that you know a lot about, and a topic that in the scholarly circles, maybe on a popular level, some people have never heard about it, but I know that in the scholarly circles, this topic is an ongoing point of discussion. Now, before we get there, okay, we're going to be talking about what's the Bible copy from paganism. But before we get there, I want you to give us a little bit of background, maybe for those who don't know you. Who is Michael Jones? How does Inspiring Philosophy came? And then after that, I'm going to ask you something about the coronavirus. But give us a little bit of your superhero origin story first.
Yeah, so I run the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy. The goal is to build an apologetic video library, have a video for every apologetic question out there. And so that's how I kind of got started, is just making videos, and it just sort of snowballed out of that from there. So I have videos that cover a wide range of topics, like arguments for God's existence, from cosmology and quantum mechanics. I have videos on Genesis. I have videos on the Trinity, New Testament reliability, Old Testament archaeology, topic we're going over today, all sorts of things.
Mike, that is fantastic. So now, you are one of the victims of the coronavirus. You I remember texting you, I don't know, what was it, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago?
It's been more than that.
Longer than that. About
for like 2 weeks.
But yeah. So tell us, what was your experience as a Christian? And I know you personally, so what is I know you're strong in the Lord. I know your faith is, given the fact that you're not only, you're not one of those who believe blindly, but you actually have your head in the books. You do the research. You understand the scriptures. You're very good at it. Coming from that perspective, what was it to be like? What was it like to be in the middle of this whole thing, and having to hold on to your faith and put your trust in Christ, even though you have all this intellectual knowledge about the fact that Christianity is true?
I mean, for me, it's never really that much of a problem, because I don't rest my faith on like passing emotions or current experiences. So it's like apples and oranges for me. Just because my life may suck temporarily, that doesn't mean that Christ has not been raised from the dead. So it's for me, it's not. It's very much an intellectual thing for me. So in understanding troubles we're going through, I also try to understand them from an intellectual perspective as well. So I try to keep focused on that. I remember like Isaiah chapter 1 calls people to reason together with God. So reason these things out. I've always just been a very analytical person, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, great, man. And we're glad that you're doing okay. We're glad that your family's doing okay. I definitely was praying for you. And I know that got a little freaked out, man. I texted you and it took you a minute to text back, and I don't know. I didn't know if you were in the hospital or something like that, but you finally uh,
No.
text back, and I'm glad that you did. So now let's just move into today's topic. Was the Bible copied from paganism? Before I ask you the first question, I wanted to ask you, how did you get interested in this topic?
Oh, that's a interesting story. I mean, the first time I ever came across it was probably way back when I just started my channel. There was a guy on YouTube called Evidence, spelled with two threes. And he was this ex-Christian who became an atheist. He did a video called A History of God. And he tried to argue that the Old Testament was copied from paganism. Genesis was copied from Babylonian texts. It's all just copied. And I was like, what? Like, this is just, I didn't know the topic that well, and I knew this was a bad argument from the get-go.
Right.
Like, his arguments were not that well. So I started reading it, and I also found that there are a lot of, I'd say, more to the liberal side of scholarship who do actually defend the position. Not like he did. They have a more intellectual grasp on it. So I wanted to try to understand where they are coming from and why they make these arguments. So that's how I got interested in the topic and why I find it really fascinating.
So what do you find out about scholars? What do they believe about the Old Testament?
So if you're more of a liberal scholar, what you're going to basically be, now this is going to vary from scholar to scholar. Some will say, there's all these different little nuances, but generally you'll say that the earliest people in Canaan that the Israelites were descended from were all polytheists. When the Israelite monarchy gets started, and even before the division, if there was one, some don't even think there was. They think that there was always a division. Like, they don't believe in Solomon or David or anything. But during the days of the monarchy, everyone was a polytheist. They worshiped multiple gods. They worshiped Yahweh and El as two distinct deities, whereas in the Bible, he's the same guy. They worshiped Asherah, Baal. They had a god of death called Mot. All these various gods. Then during the Josiah reforms or during the Babylonian exile, the monotheistic idea started to evolve. And so they started to say, well, we should only worship this one patron deity of Israel called Yahweh. And then they went back and they changed scriptures. They edited things out, reorganized the story of Abraham, so made him a monotheist, that kind of stuff. Then by the time of the Babylonian exile, they're strict monotheist. So that's what the liberal scholarship view is. It takes the biblical worldview and turns it on its head. It's not so much that they started out monotheist, it's that they started out polytheist, and then they evolved into monotheist from there.
Interesting. So we hear things like that, but we also hear things like the claim that Noah's flood account comes from things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Is this true? Because we hear it a lot, especially in the blogosphere, right?
Yeah, I hear that a lot in the blogosphere. The problem is when you start asking scholars, they don't say that. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is this long account of some king of Uruk that predates the age of writing. And he goes on all these long quests, and in the last of his quests, he visits this guy called the flood hero of the Gilgamesh, who is this immortal on the edge of the world, and he tells him the flood story. And there are some similarities in there with the biblical flood account. And so a lot of laymen on the internet say, well, Noah's flood account was copied from the Gilgamesh flood account. That is extremely unlikely. For example, most scholars, this is coming from a scholar named Scott Nagel, he'll note that the Epic of Gilgamesh was sort of updated over time. The account we have now is an Assyrian version. And what he would say is most scholars see this section, the flood account in Gilgamesh, as the work of a late editor, someone from the 7th century BC. So sometime around the 600 BC. They added it into the Gilgamesh account, that it probably wasn't there originally. Someone like another scholar like Jeffrey Tigay also notes that basically the late version of Gilgamesh didn't have a flood account. And if you hold to the documentary hypothesis, which I don't, but a lot of liberal scholars hold to a version of that, you're going to note that the flood account is in the J source, and that goes back to Israel prior to the 7th century. So if you're going on the documentary hypothesis, you have to admit the flood account in Israel predates the flood account in Gilgamesh. So the problem right there, it couldn't have come. Most scholars don't see them as one copying the other. They seem to be independent traditions working on the same cultural idea that there was this ancient flood. So there's a scholar named Jean Bottero, and in this book, Everyday Life in Ancient Mesopotamia, he says, though the more than substantial identity with the Babylonian flood, it's not the least doubt. There are too many divergent details between the two for the account in Genesis to be regarded simply as a transcript in the Hebrew of the Akkadian text of Atrahasis or Gilgamesh. So he basically flat out notes that there are so many divergent differences between the two. You can't say one is copying the other. It makes far more sense to say that they're basically independent traditions talking about the same idea. So people know there's similarities. Like there's a flood hero, he builds an ark, he sends out birds. But if you start to go through the differences, they overtake the similarities. So in the Bible, the flood is sent because of sin. In Gilgamesh, there's no reason given. Noah was chosen because he's righteous. In Gilgamesh, the flood hero is not, we're not told why. The Bible says Noah preached righteousness. In Gilgamesh, the flood hero lied to the humans about the coming flood. He said that, he's being taken away, and so they had to help him build a boat to get away. There's different shapes and sizes. In Gilgamesh, there's a bunch of people saved. In the Bible, only Noah is saved. The flood only lasts 7 days, 7 nights. In the Bible, it's 40 days, 40 nights. In the Bible, he lands in the Ararat or Ratu Mountains. In Gilgamesh, it's Mount Nimish. Even the order of birds is different. The reason they made sacrifices, a lot of differences. And so scholars from David Sumuru, Kenneth Kitchen, Jean Bottero, W.G. Lambert, Alan Millard will note these are just different accounts. And just because there are vague similarities, that's no reason to show that there's dependence.
Yeah, there's a correlation there. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I got a great question related to the Babylonian story, the Numa, Ilic. But before I get there, I want to ask everybody, if you're watching on either one of the pages on Facebook, please share this stream right now. We want to hit the goal today of having 50 shares on Facebook. And if you can bring people into the YouTube thing, if you want to share it in any of the social media platforms that you use, go ahead on and share it right now. This information needs to get out there. So we're trying to hit 50 shares on this broadcast. So help us get there. Now, Mike, what about the Babylonian and Numa Ilic? Did this influence Genesis?
Yeah, that's another claim I remember that the video by Evidence was arguing, is that somehow Genesis was influenced by the Numa Ilic. Now, for those who don't know, the Numa Ilic is this Babylonian account of origins. It explains how the god Marduk created the world and how he was elected to be the head god. And so what some people have noted is that in the Numa Ilic, Marduk fights this dragon called Tiamat. And then he defeats Tiamat, and he takes Tiamat and divides her in half. And the one half of her becomes the sky, the other becomes the earth below and the waters and all that stuff. And there's all this idea of watery chaos in there as well. Now, if you read Genesis 1, God divides the firmament from the waters below. And so there's a division going there. Also, it says the spirit of God, or a wind of God, was hovering over the face of the deep. And the Hebrew word for deep is Tehom. So some people said, well, Tehom sounds like Tiamat. Maybe Genesis is sort of it's like a Hebrew version of the Numa Ilic. Is that instead of Marduk, it's Yahweh who defeats the dragon, the Tehom, Tiamat thing, then divides the waters, creating the sky and the oceans. A lot of problems with that. First, that is like the only possible connection you could make in the two. The rest are completely different. The point of the Numa Ilic is to show that Marduk has been elected as the head god over all the other gods. It's not necessarily about creation. That's kind of like a side story in there. The other problem is the Hebrew word in Genesis 1, Tehom, is masculine. Tiamat is a feminine word. Now, English speakers may not think that's a big deal, but in other languages, it's like Spanish, it is a big deal because some words are feminine, some are masculine. Yeah. So you can't really derive a masculine word from a feminine word. That's very unlikely. Tehom probably has nothing to do with Tiamat. So one of the leading scholars on this, his name is David Toshio Sumuru. He says in the book, I Studied Inscriptions from Before the Flood, he says, Genesis 1 and the Numa Ilic, which was composed primarily to exalt Marduk in the pantheon of Babylon, have no direct relation to each other. It It is not correct to say that a Numa Elish was adopted and adapted by the Israelites to produce the Genesis story. As W.G. Lambert holds, there is no evidence of Hebrew borrowing from Babylon. So this constant idea we hear that the Hebrews were taken to the Babylonian exile and then they were borrowing from them is kind of ridiculous. We're told two things. It's kind of ironic by very liberal scholars. We're told that the Israelites during the Babylonian exile were borrowing stories from these polytheistic Babylonians. Then we're also told that during the Babylonian exile, the Jews there were so disgusted by polytheism and they were strict monotheists. So you're telling me these very orthodox, strict monotheists were also borrowing from the polytheists. Something's amiss here. That doesn't make sense. So there's these contradictory ideas there that scholars like James Hoffmeyer have noted. So it's very unlikely. And so what scholars do with like a Numa Elish or Atrahasis or Gilgamesh is they find vague similarities and they run wild with them. It's very similar to what Jesus mysticists do sometimes, is that they'll find these vague similarities and they'll run wild with them. And the truth is, there's not a lot of good evidence. Just a quick side note is a lot of scholars also say that during this time, the Jews were borrowing from Zoroastrianism. Problem. The earliest Hebrew scriptures we have go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The earliest Zoroastrian scriptures we have are like 10th century AD, maybe 8th century AD.
Wow.
And we don't even think the Avesta, that's the Zoroastrian holy text, was composed until the 4th century AD. And Zoroastrian scholars will note they were trying to do apologetic work to prevent converts leaving them to go to Christianity and Islam. So it's possible Zoroastrianists were borrowing from Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Not that the Jews were borrowing from Zoroastrian.
The other way around, yeah.
During the Babylonian exile. So, when you start to look at the details, these arguments fall apart easily.
Yeah, don't make sense. And that's the thing. I think you touch on something very important, that they see some similarity and then just harp on that thing and they build their whole argument on one of those. Now, we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. We talk about the Babylonian Numa Elish. Why do scholars believe that the Bible evolved from polytheistic culture?
So we have to remember, the more sophisticated scholars, they'll argue that Israel was a Canaanite group, and it's true, they lived in Canaan. I mean, there's no denying that. And their cultural parallels are more closer to places like Ugarit, other surrounding cultures like Edom, the Ammonites, these surrounding cultures. And so these cultures were all polytheistic. Our earliest records in the late Bronze Age show that these were polytheistic groups. Israel sort of, they would say, emerges out of them. They don't believe there was a conquest. They think they just sort of were in there. They may have been a slight one, but it was, embellished. And so Canaanites became the Israelites in a lot of their views. Again, not all. They're very nuanced depending on which scholar you read. And they'll say that, they were all polytheists in the late Bronze Age. By the time of the Iron Age, you start to see some monolatristic ideas with Yahweh. And so that's where the evolution is sort of coming from. There's a lot of problems with that. And the verses they use to support it are very few and far in between. So they'll try to argue from places like Deuteronomy 32. That's a pretty big verse they like to use, verses 8 to 9, to try to show that Israel was originally like a polytheistic culture, and then slowly they evolved out of monotheism.
Wow. Well, following that line of thinking, man.
Yeah.
What other biblical passages do liberal scholars use to claim this whole evolution?
So the big one is Deuteronomy 32, 8 to 9. And I'll read it with the original languages. So when Elion, that's the word for Most High. So when Elion gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of El. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. Now on the surface, when you hear that, you think, okay, this Most High divided the nations according to the sons of El, and Yahweh got a portion, Jacob. Liberal scholars hark on this. I mean, there's entire books written about this to try to say, see, Yahweh was originally like a son of El, and he got his portion, which was Jacob, the people of Israel. Problem. When you start to dive into the details of this whole passage, it's very hard to make that argument. And even liberal scholars like Mark Smith will acknowledge the author was a monotheist. what he's doing is he's taking this old polytheistic idea and he's kind of revamping it to how it would be understood in a monotheistic culture. Another scholar named Otto Eichfeldt says this. He says, the author of the Psalm, it's Deuteronomy 32, it is true when speaking of Yahweh's relationship to his people, avoids, probably intentionally, the application of the hitherto used active verbal form, and so does not say directly that Elion gave Israel or Jacob to Yahweh as his portion, but is content to establish the fact that Israel has just become the property of Yahweh. So a perfectly easily way to read this passage is just to say that Yahweh, the Most High, divided the nations and then just preserved a people for himself. And that seems to fit with the context, because later in the passage it refers to Yahweh being like this, the only one, like the divine council supposed to bow down to him. There is no, it says in verse 39, there is no God beside him, sort of like anointing like this special status.
Right.
And so even scholars like Mark Smith, who think Yahweh was originally like a Canaanite storm god, will acknowledge the author was a strict monotheist who's just taking these old polytheistic ideas and sort of revolutionizing them, like saying like, yeah, your polytheists think that, you know, this El figure divided the nation, but really that's Yahweh. And this is what he did. And he made us special, these special people for him. So what I find from a lot of liberal scholars is they do this with places like Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32. And it seems like they're digging into like these little passages and kind of cherry picking them a little bit and running wild with them again. It seems like from the biblical author's standpoint, they were always monotheists. It's very hard to sort of derive these old polytheistic evolutionary ideas that they want to find so much.
So let me ask you, because I heard you saying, in this passage, how the superiority of Yahweh sort of comes through. Could it be that the biblical authors were taking shots at these ideas of these other lesser gods? It's so in a sort of polemic way. What do you think about that?
Well, I absolutely do think that. I think there's a lot of polemics throughout the Bible. I think you can find them in places like Isaiah 14. There might be some in Genesis 1, but they'd be very, very implicit if that's the case. I think what they're doing here is there's an Israelite author. And now at Ugarit, there is this idea that the head god El sort of did divide the nations up. And there was places where he claims he allotted territory to the gods of Egypt, which is Egypt. I think what they're doing is they're saying, yeah, we understand that this head god divided the nations up, but that's really Yahweh. And he preserved a special people for himself. So I think they're taking these old polytheistic ideas and they're trying to explain to the polytheists what's really going on from a monotheistic standpoint.
I understand. So do we have any good arguments to show that the Bible did not evolve from polytheism, Mike?
Oh, yeah. So we have a ton of arguments. I did a video on my channel called Israel's Revolutionary Monotheism. I go through about 20 different arguments to show that there's not if you're going to argue that the Israelite religion evolved from polytheism, you have to deal with these anomalies. And it's very hard to do that from an evolutionary standpoint. But if the biblical account is true, that there's this revolutionary idea, there's this guy named Moses who came on the scene and says, okay, we're going to worship Yahweh in a very unique way. Here's what's going to be a revolutionary sudden change. There's a lot of data that fits with that. So one of my favorite things is this idea that in the biblical accounts, or in the Hebrew language, there is no Hebrew word for goddess. Now, when I first read that, I thought it was wrong. And so I contacted a scholar and I said, hey, I think this guy got something wrong. Is it true? And he said, no, that's accurate. And this guy was more of a liberal scholar. And it's a weird anomaly, but it just is. Now, you may be like, what's the big deal? There's no Hebrew word for goddess. Well, we have to remember that language precedes culture. I might say I'm going to write an email, but really I'm going to type out an email. Writing is a cultural artifact left over from the days when we used to write things out. Same thing is true for the Hebrew, or for the Israelite language, through Hebrew. They had a lot of ideas that were, a lot of their language reflected an ancient nomadic past. Now, if language precedes culture, and there's no Hebrew word for goddess, that would imply there were no goddesses in ancient Israel, because they weren't polytheists, they were just monotheists. And that later, when they started worshiping Asherah, like, you know, in their days of rebellion, they didn't have a word for that. So it sort of reflects an earlier idea that perhaps Israel was monotheistic before they rebelled and became polytheistic. Other ideas we see throughout the text is like Yahweh is not manifested in nature, like all the other polytheistic deities, like Baal, the gods of Egypt. I mean, Baal's like a storm god. Yahweh is also perceived as genderless, which is odd to do because all the ancient pagan gods had a gender. Yahweh has no needs. So when you sacrifice to him, you're not doing it because Yahweh needs food. Like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood hero sacrifices to the gods because they're actually hungry. Yahweh doesn't have any needs in the biblical text.
So what you're saying is Yahweh don't get the munchies.
No, and that's odd because in the ancient world, that was how you traded with the gods, basically. The gods would provide you with gifts or protection, and you would give them sacrifices for food. You provide them gifts. So there was like a trade. It was like this, the gods needed humans and the humans needed gods. And that's how the temples made money. I mean, you come there because you'd want to contact a god for help. In the biblical text, you can't do that. So and from a pragmatic economic standpoint, the Israelite religion should have collapsed because it was a horrible model in terms of the pragmatic system that was already set up in the ancient Near East. Right. Why are you sacrificing to Yahweh? Because he demanded it. Well, what are you getting out of it? He doesn't have anything that we need.
Right.
What's the point?
Yeah, that's great, man. Well, there is a ton of information. Tell people where they can learn more about this and all the other topics that you cover on your research.
Everything is on my website or my channel. It's at youtube.com/inspiring philosophy. And I'm going through a whole range of topics. I'm going to, in a week, I'll be adding more videos to my Genesis series. I have a video on neuroscientific evidence coming out this summer. I'll have some videos I'll have a video probably later this year on the archaeology of where the Tower of Babel was. So I'll be putting a video out arguing that it was a historical place that actually happened around 3400 BC.
Excellent. And your website is inspiringphilosophy.com or .org?
.org.
So inspiringphilosophy.org. Make sure you go support Mike in anything that he does. He does fantastic work. Now we're about to transition to Q&A. All right. But we have a little treat. Again, first of all, I want to get to 50 shares. So please go ahead on and hit that button. Share these with your friends. Tag people on the comment section. And then we come back to your questions. Now, remember, in order for your questions to be considered for the show, make sure you type question in all caps in front of the question, or you can tag whatever account or page you're watching from. Now, Mike, me and you got together, I would say, a couple months ago? Was that February?
Yeah, I knew this was coming.
Okay. And then, well, I told you, I warned you earlier. So, you had some amazing shots taken by capturing Christianity's Cameron Bertuzzi. So we're going to play a little game, and it's going to be called, Is Michael Jones Photogenic? Okay? So I want the audience right now, this is how it's going to work. I want the audience right now to be ready to score the pictures of Mike. Okay, you're gonna put from 1 to 10 if Mike Jones is photogenic. Okay, so here is the first picture. Let me see if I can bring it up. Right there. You see it, Mike? Mm-hmm. Everybody see it. So this is Mike. So I want to make sure, guys, everybody who are watching right now, make sure you give me your opinion if Mike Jones is photogenic. This is picture number 1. Okay, I'm going to give you a few seconds. Go ahead on and vote. And then we move on to the next picture. So now we're going to have 2 pictures side by side. And we're going to put down to see if Mike Jones is photogenic. Who? Mike Jones. So now, second picture.
There we go.
Look at that. Look at that. This guy, look at that. Come on. You guys need to just hit number at the 10. This is a 10. A 10 on the left, a 10 on the right. Okay, actually, I'm just so generous. I'm just going to put it full screen so you can see it. Look at that. Is Mike Jones photogenic? Absolutely. I would say I'd give it an 11 if I could. Are you guys ready for the next picture? Are you ready, Mike, for the next picture?
I'm ready, yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do it. So here you go, guys. is Mike Jones photogenic. How about this one? Let's
Yeah,
full
very
screen
much.
this. Is that a pic? What do you rate yourself here, Mike?
Cold.
A 10? Is it a 10, a 15, a 20?
It was very cold in South Carolina.
It was.
So
Listen,
whatever the temperature was, that's what I rated.
How about this one? Let's just add one more. What about this one, ladies and gentlemen? Now, he's not even cold anymore because he came out of his shell and now he is superhero posing. Okay, so please rate this picture. And then in just a second, I have the winning picture. And I'm just going to full screen it. I'm going to bring back, continue to vote. Is Mike Jones photogenic? Are you guys ready? Are you ready for the treat of the century? 3, 2, 1. There you go. Guys,
look at how jealous that Vocab is behind
I know.
me.
Vocab is looking like, how can I really have that swag on me? Vocab wear glasses all the time and hats all the time. Dude, all you have to wear is a blanket.
Exactly.
And you light years ahead of this guy. So there you go. We're going to reveal the results of this at the end of the live stream. So, Mike, thank you for playing. Is Mike Jones photogenic? Thank you for being part and just having a little fun with us. You knew this was coming.
Oh, yeah.
You knew it. You knew it. So I definitely, this is the sort of ammunition that I live for, right? And I don't blackmail you or anything because I know you really don't care. So that's why I was able to just play around. But I'm sure that everybody, you see people saying, man, love it. Everybody's loving it, man. At least over here on Facebook, everybody's loving it. I have to check the rest of the platforms, but my team is doing that right now. Well, Mike, let's go to the fun part. Let's go to the Q&A. Right, got number one. You're really good dealing with Jesus mythicists and all of these nonsensical stuff that we find online. So number one, what's your response to saying that someone saying that Jesus was copied from, I don't know how to say this, Serapis or Serapis?
Oh, Serapis.
Serapis. Yeah.
To be fair, we don't really know because we're talking about an ancient Egyptian word, or ancient Greek word, I guess would be, but an ancient Egyptian god. So yeah, people who say that, you don't really get you don't get any scholars saying that because they're not stupid. But the idea Jesus was like a copy of Serapis is one of the dumbest copycats out there. Richard Carrier, who tries to make some parallels with Jesus to pagan deities, he doesn't say copy, but he tries to make parallels. He doesn't even touch this one because he knows how dumb it is. There's not a shred of evidence of this at all. What they're getting it from is this work called the Historia Augusta, I believe is what it's called. And it's like this late forgery of a work that's filled with anachronisms, that makes too many errors. And it talks about how there were these Christians in Egypt around 100 AD, so after Christ, but even postdates Christ, but it says in 100 AD there were these Christians worshiping Serapis in Egypt. The problem is that historians have noted for years this work is filled with anachronisms, it's historically inaccurate, gets so many things wrong. It's probably not even written by the emperor who claims to be writing this, and so there's really no evidence. Serapis was like a Greek deity, like a synchronizing of different Egyptian and Greek ideas. And he was worshipped in Egypt. And what we know about him is that he seems to be more based on like a combination of Osiris and the Apis bull. Nothing really to do with Jesus. He doesn't really die. I mean, he doesn't resurrect, obviously. There's very little we know about him, but the idea that he's connected to Jesus is just it's a laughing stock to scholars, and there's no evidence of it. So people who make this claim have to sort of concoct evidence out of thin air or pick works that we know are just forgeries. It's a horrible argument.
Yeah, terrible. Well, what about this one? Is there more evidence for a local flood or for a worldwide flood?
There is far more evidence for a local flood, I would argue. No, I would say more of a regional flood. Mm-hmm. About 8,000 to 13,000 years ago, there was a period on Earth called the Younger Dryas period. Very radical shifts, and we sort of came out of it instantaneously, probably with a bunch of with a rise in sea level. And around the same time, there was a geologist in the area who noted that there seems to have been a rapid, catastrophic flood in the region of the Middle East. It was sudden, caused by a lot of rain. filled up the whole area, created this mega lake, and then drained maybe 6 months to a year later. So that fits perfectly with what we see in the biblical account. Now, in the Bible, I would argue that it also fits with a regional flood. And my argument is from Genesis 8. In Genesis 8:5, it says that the ark came to rest in the region of Aratu or Ararat, and it says the tops of the mountains were seen. So they can see mountains in the distance. Genesis 8:9 says when Noah released the dove, it said the dove found no place to rest her foot, for the water was still on the face of the whole earth. Okay, but I thought mountains were already seen, so the water's really not on the face of the whole earth. What's going on there? Okay, probably when they're talking about in verse 8:9, they're using it more like a hyperbolic nature. So it's probably, when it talks about the flood covering the whole earth, like Genesis 8:9, it's probably hyperbolic. And it's probably more of a regional flood within that area. That fits with the geological record. It also seems to fit with the data of Genesis 8.
Very good, man. Now this one, I got a Sam Butner, and what up, Sam? He's my boy. He always leaving great comments and questions. Can you clarify what do you mean when you say liberal scholars?
So I would say that's a good question. So if you're a conservative scholar, you tend to take the Bible more at its word. You think there was a historical Abraham. He really was monotheist about El Yahweh. Moses as well. You take the Exodus as like a real historical account. If you're a liberal scholar, you tend to look at a lot of that in terms of like a minimalist scholarship, that a lot of the Israelite history is sort of mythological, it's sort of fabricated, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. So they may not believe that Solomon existed, definitely not Moses. If he did, he wasn't like he was in the Bible. Then a lot of the past of Israel was sort of concocted by later authors. And so that tends to be what the liberal scholars tend to gravitate towards that idea. It's in Old Testament scholarship, it's also called minimalist and maximalist. If you're a maximalist, you're more of a conservative. If you're a minimalist, you're more of towards the arguments that, a lot of the biblical history is sort of embellished or fabricated.
Yeah, so in terms of conferences, one is ETS and the other one is ASBL, but that's just for those who know. I'm seeing a lot of comments, great comments, and people pushing back about the global flood. Look, guys, this is what we do. Please disagree with us. This is exactly how you stimulate good conversation, even if it's an intramural debate. So please, we love your comments. We love you, even if you don't agree with our guests. I don't agree with myself half of the time because I'm always trying to learn more and add data to what I already know. So I want just
If you want more data, I do have 2 videos on my channel on the flood, and in 1 week from today, I'm uploading a 3rd one where I'm going to explain, if the flood was regional, why did Noah have to build an ark? Why were there animals on the ark? Right. So I'll be covering that in a week.
Well, that's great. And also, people, please, when we do this, it's for your, we want to build you up. We want to, edify you. And part of this is search the scriptures and learn how to be okay. If it's not a salvific issue, let's go ahead on and be together in this. So I like that. The fact that when they're putting comments like this, I really appreciate it because we're able to give people different perspectives in one live stream. Now, let me move on to the next question right here. And it's about Jesus's birth. A copy from Krishna's story. Go.
Yeah, no. That's a horror. Yeah, I can't believe some people make that. I mean, Krishna's story is nothing like Jesus. There's no wise men. There's no gifts. I mean, he's not born of a virgin. I'm not even sure where they get this idea. It's not in any of the Krishna texts. And even if it was, the biographies of Krishna post-date Christianity in terms of when they were written. Now, Hindus claim they're 10,000 years old, and there's no evidence of that. The biographies, I think it's called the Gita. It starts with a B. I forget how do you pronounce the first word, but it's the Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita or something like that, right?
Something like that, yeah. It seems to date at the earliest you could date. It's like 2nd century AD. Probably dates to 3rd or 4th century AD. This is when the biographies were written. I'm not saying that the worship of Krishna didn't exist before this, but when the biographies were put down, it post-dates Christ. Same with the biographies for Buddha. these post-date Christ, they could not have influenced the New Testament.
Right. So this one is good. I think I got Linda on YouTube. Oh, let's see. Yeah, Linda on YouTube, and I got another one on Facebook, and they're along the same lines. I'm gonna read it. And Craig says, "What's wrong with, evolving from polytheism if the idea was that God was setting aside people for himself?" That's number one. Hold on. Then Linda says, wasn't Abraham a polytheist before God contacted him? And just to top it off, says, wouldn't the people likely come from whatever people were available? So in other words, what's wrong that this whole thing moved from polytheism to monotheism? Then Abraham get pretty much his idea, his theistic idea sort of squared away, and say, hey, now you were doing something wrong, and was he a polytheist before God calling him out of Ur?
Right, and he obviously was. I mean, the Bible says it. In fact, his father's name is Terah. That's a word for moon in Hebrew. And where does Abraham come from? It's the city of Ur. The patron deity of Ur was the god Nana, who was a moon god. Terra, moon god. Seems to make sense. The reason why it doesn't make sense to say evolutionary, and why I would say it's probably more revolutionary, is because the biblical account says it was like this immediate change for Abraham. Is that Yahweh shows up and says, worship only me now. An evolutionary idea would be the idea that Abraham was a polytheist, Moses was a polytheist, David was worshipped many gods, but with like a special focus on Yahweh. Then Josiah was only worshiping Yahweh, but acknowledging there were other gods. And then the Babylonian exile was their strict monotheists. You have it's got to take several generations on the evolutionary view. On the revolutionary view, it seems to happen instantaneously with Abraham, and then later again with Moses. And then, of course, again with David as well. There's a lot of revolutionary ideas because Israel keeps going after these other gods constantly, and Yahweh keeps trying to call them back. So that's the problem with the evolutionary ideas. It would argue that you have to have a slow, gradual change generation to generation. The biblical account doesn't really argue that, and I would argue, based on the video I did, Israel's revolutionary monotheism, there are too many biblical anomalies that would fit with the evolutionary model. It seems to fit more with the sudden revolutionary model.
Well, I love that phrase that you said, is more revolutionary than evolutionary, because they really came, and it was completely sort of unique in terms of the way it was presented in the Pentateuch, right? Danny asks, how do you respond to those that say that the book of Daniel is fictionally written in the 2nd century?
Right. So if it was written in the 2nd century, it doesn't mean it's fiction. It just means they're recounting history. And so there are some interesting arguments for Daniel that I know that I have not had the time to look in, because for the past 2 years, I've been researching this monotheistic topic as well as evidence for Genesis. When I get to Daniel, I'm going to study that a little bit more and look for the arguments for and against it. I think some people are sort of jumping the gun on this. I know Michael Brown has written as to why it's probably more historical and probably fits a later time, like when Jesus shows up, not the time of the dynasties during the 2nd century that were sort of fighting over Israel and whatnot. So check out that. I'm not the expert on it right now because I've currently not studied it that much. So check out that direction. I think JP Holding on his website Tectonics has done something as well, but again, I've not read his articles on it, so I don't know.
Right. Well, I got a couple up here, and maybe you can send people to some of your videos. This one, Abba's daughter from YouTube says, what's